From the time I was very young, I was influenced by my family to believe in the existence of God. Every week, I would go to church with my parents and listen to God's teachings. My parents taught me to respect my elders. They also taught me to help those who are in trouble. I have never touched illegal drugs because I understand the dangers of drugs to one's physical and mental health as well as to society. I know that as a Christian, I have a responsibility to protect myself and others from harm. When I was 19 years old, I tried alcohol, but I soon realized it wasn't for me. I was repulsed by the taste. I also understood that alcohol was potentially harmful to the human body. As a result, I decided to give up drinking to keep myself sober and healthy. My greatest hobby is fishing and hunting with friends. When I was 20 years old, I got my first job as an apprentice in an auto repair shop. This job was both an opportunity and a challenge for me. While saving the money I earned, I worked hard to learn auto repair skills and continue to improve my professionalism. From simple maintenance to complex engine troubleshooting, I tried to do my best. I dream of owning my own auto repair shop one day. Although this job is very hard, I know it is the only way to realize my dream. I had to rely on my own efforts to change my fate. After 4 years of hard work, I finally realized my dream. With the support of my friends, we opened a garage together. This was an important moment in my life and I felt proud and satisfied. On July 3, 2004, I worked late in the store that day. Due to financial constraints, I could not afford an electric lift, so we often worked with a hydraulic jack. Working with a hydraulic jack can be a relatively laborious and time-consuming task. While I was checking the car chassis, an accident happened. The hydraulic jack suddenly deflected and the car's chassis pressed against my chest. I instantly felt severe pain, breathing became extremely difficult. I struggled hard, but could not move my body. I could only call for help in the pain. Due to the lack of oxygen and severe pain, the sound I made was very faint. At that moment, I was in a state of panic and helplessness. I could only lie there in pain. Time seemed to become a blur, and I could not determine how long I had been lying there. Slowly, I drifted off to sleep. When I awoke, a sharp pain in my chest reawakened me. I realized that I was not free from my predicament. This repeated torture made me feel desperate. As time passed, I stopped feeling the pain. Suddenly, I was floating above the car. I looked down and found my body lying there, as if it had stopped breathing. Just then, a spinning black hole appeared around me, drawing my attention. It radiated a mysterious power, and I approached the portal curiously. The moment I stepped into the portal, a powerful force surrounded me. I felt myself moving at lightning speed. The portal was translucent, and I could see clearly what was outside. I saw myself leaving the Earth's atmosphere and my body moving fast through the galaxy. The stars were shining beautifully. I felt a sense of infinite freedom that was so intense. I have heard many people say that a light appears at the end of the tunnel. I can now tell you responsibly that it is true. When I entered that light, I was pushed out by a force. I instantly arrived at a peaceful and beautiful meadow. This meadow was filled with green grass, and a gentle breeze blew against them. This meadow was filled with all kinds of flowers, each emitting a charming fragrance. As I continued to walk along the meadow, I felt a sense of peace and harmony. I noticed that the flowers here were in many colors I had never seen before, and they bloomed with a glorious light, as beautiful as a rainbow. After a while, I came to a clear stream. A small wooden bridge spanned over the stream. When I crossed the bridge, I saw a house. The house was surrounded by a garden. A man approached me. As he drew closer, I was surprised to find that he looked almost identical to me. My mind was filled with confusion and I couldn't help but ask, "Why do you look like me?" I was full of doubts. He smiled and replied, "I am your twin brother." This answer confused me even more, because I had never heard that I had a twin brother. I replied firmly, "I don't have a twin brother." He laughed and gently explained that I was born very healthy. But he unfortunately died young. I was shocked to hear this news. He invited me to come with him to his home. I felt his warmth and sincerity, so I followed him into the house. When I entered the house, I found it very cozy. There were several beautiful landscape paintings hanging on the wall. The furniture was neatly arranged. I sat with him on the comfortable sofa. We continued to talk and share our experiences with each other. His voice was gentle and infectious, and every word was full of wisdom. He told me about his unique perspective on the world. Together we discussed the meaning of life. He gave me profound insights that helped me better understand and face the challenges in life. In his home, I gradually came to understand the true meaning of life. He invited me to go for a walk in the garden with him. After walking for some time, a building appeared in the distance. It emitted a dazzling light. It seemed to be suspended in the air and gave off a mysterious atmosphere. I asked what was inside that building. He smiled and replied, "That is where God often appears. This building is a sanctuary to connect with God. There, people can have spiritual dialogue and communication with God and seek wisdom and guidance." I was very surprised to hear this answer. Now God was actually so close to me. We moved toward the building, each step accompanied by an inner excitement. As we got closer, the building glowed brighter and brighter. It seemed to be constructed of pure white marble, and the entire building shone brightly in the sunlight. The shape of the building presented an elegant and stately design. It has streamlined curves and exquisite carvings. The main entrance of the building has two huge pillars with intricate and exquisite carvings in relief. The door is inlaid with precious stones. As we entered the doors of that building, my soul was baptized. At that very moment, an angel appeared before us. The angel was tall and majestic in size. Her wings seemed to be woven of pure light. Each feather shone with a silvery glow. The angel wore a long, white robe that fluttered gently. Her face is gentle and serene. Her presence emanated a divine aura, and the air around her seemed to become fresh and pure. The angel's voice was soft and warm. She told me that it was time to go back to my original life. To bring the knowledge I had learned back into the real world. Although I did not want to leave here, I understood that I had to go back now. With the guidance of the angels, I left the building. After I said goodbye to them, I went back into the portal and a powerful force pulled me forward. I traveled across the galaxy and back to Earth. The speed was like lightning. In an instant, I was back at the repair shop. The sun shone through the window on the floor, warm and bright. I knew that it was already the next morning. Suddenly, I heard someone open the door. I knew that I had to go back into my body and reconnect with the real world. I tried to lie down next to my body, but nothing worked. I felt confused and frustrated and didn't know how to go back. Just then, I heard a voice, as if it were a guide from deep within. It gently told me to enter through my head. I focused my mind and prepared to try again. My consciousness and body began to gradually merge and I could feel a warm energy flowing through me. When I opened my eyes again, I found that I had managed to get back into my body. I felt my breath and heard the beating of my heart. I realized that I had returned to the real world. I began to cry out for help, hoping to get my friend's attention. He was very worried about me and immediately called the emergency number of the fire department. Firefighters quickly arrived on the scene. The firefighters quickly launched a rescue operation, using specialized equipment to free me from my predicament. I was successfully pulled out of harm's way. I looked gratefully at the rescuers and expressed my gratitude to them. I was taken to the hospital for further examination and treatment. The doctors were surprised at my condition. I did not have broken ribs. Only extensive bruises and abrasions. To make sure I had no other potential injuries, the doctors decided to keep me in the hospital for 2 days for observation. After 2 days of observation, the doctors confirmed that I was in good health and did not experience any discomfort or complications. On the 3rd day, I walked out of the hospital. Although my body was still a little tired, I felt very happy. This experience made me understand how fragile and precious life is. I returned home with great excitement, and the first person I wanted to see was my mother. My mother's face lit up with happiness and joy. She quickly walked towards me and hugged me tightly. After dinner, we sat together in a warm and cordial atmosphere. There was some concern inside me, and I didn't know how to mention to her about my injury experience, because I didn't want to worry her. I gently asked my mother if I had a twin brother. My mother's expression instantly became complicated and her eyes became moist. She began to weep incessantly. My mother grabbed my hand, and her voice trembled a little. She told me that I did have a twin brother, but he passed away shortly after birth. She never told me this fact to protect me so that I could grow up happy. I was shocked to hear this news. I stroked my mother's hand and whispered to comfort her, telling her she didn't have to hide the secret anymore. I loved her deeply and appreciated everything she had done for me. Later, I shared my experience with a few friends. Most of them were happy for me when they heard it. We discussed about the possibility of the supernatural. However, one friend approached my experience with skepticism. He told me that it was just a hallucination I was having. He tried to explain my experience with science. Despite the skepticism, I tried to remain calm and rational. I know that everyone has their own beliefs and opinions. My experience is difficult for them to accept. I respect their opinions. But I also hold fast to my own beliefs. I don't need everyone to believe in my experiences, it's important that I know they are true for myself. My experiences have changed my perception of life. I decided to keep this experience within myself and use it to inspire and remind myself. Everyone has their own beliefs and opinions, and we can respect and understand each other.
This experience happened when I was 25 years old. I received an invitation to a friend's wedding. This friend lived in another city, so I planned to stay with him for 3 days. I was looking forward to the wedding because I hadn't seen my friend in 6 months. However, the night after I arrived at my friend's house, I received an urgent phone call from my family. They told me that my grandfather had fallen at home and had been admitted to the hospital for treatment. Hearing this news, I felt very worried. I knew very well that my grandfather's health was very important to the whole family, so I decided to go home immediately. When my friend found out about my situation, he suggested that I return home the next morning. It was already too late and he thought it would be dangerous to drive the vehicle for a long time at night. Although my friend's advice was reasonable, I could not ignore the needs of my family. At around 2 a.m., I said goodbye to my friend and prepared to drive home. I was worried about my grandfather's health. I called my family on the drive and asked about my grandfather's current condition. They told me the doctors were doing their best to treat him, but the specifics were uncertain. On my way home, there weren't many cars. There were no highways like there are now. I was driving along a narrow country road. Suddenly, I noticed a pickup truck coming from the opposite direction and with its high beams on. It was driving in my lane and I hastily swerved to the right to try to avoid it. The road was too narrow for me to completely avoid the vehicle. Unfortunately, I collided with the pickup truck. After the collision occurred, I lost control of my vehicle. After running off the road, it fell into a nearby field. It all happened so fast that I didn't have time to react any further. After the accident, I realized that I was very badly injured. I felt pain all over my body. A few minutes later, a bus passed by the scene of the accident. They stopped immediately and decided to take me to a nearby hospital. They carried me to the bus and notified the hospital. On the way to the hospital, I became increasingly unconscious. At the hospital, the doctors began treating me. The pain I felt in my body was unbearable. I was lying on the bed in the operating room with strange smells filling my surroundings. I began to doubt everything and became frustrated with everything and everyone. I felt like my life was in a state of chaos. My mind flooded with complaints and anger. I hadn't been put under anesthesia and hadn't gone into a coma. Every breath I took was a torture. The pain from which there was no escape made me feel helpless and desperate. Suddenly, I felt a relief that I had never felt before. This feeling was the opposite of the pain I had felt a few minutes before. I felt like everything had become perfect. When I opened my eyes, I was floating above my body. I found myself able to perceive the thoughts of others. I was able to detect the tension and concern within the nurses. One of the nurses was thinking to herself how sad it was that this young man had passed away like this. I wanted to tell her that I was fine and didn't need to worry. I wanted to slap this nurse with my hand. Instead, my hand went through her shoulder, creating no touch or resistance. This strange sensation was very confusing to me. I began to realize that I was now in a very special state. I tried to communicate my thoughts to her through thought or intention, but she did not respond. At a certain point, I thought of my mother. At that very moment, I immediately appeared in front of her. I saw her concentrating on washing some vegetables and preparing the ingredients needed for dinner. This scene was very peculiar to me because I was in two places at the same time. I tried to hug her from behind, but when my hand touched her body, my hand went right through her body. I also visited some friends. I tried to talk to them and share my feelings, but they didn't seem to see me or hear me. It was as if I was in a parallel space separated from the real world. As I was thinking about my grandfather, a force took me back to the hospital in my hometown. When I entered the hospital room, I saw my grandfather lying on the hospital bed. I could feel that his life was fading away. The doctors and nurses were doing their best to save him. I flew to my grandfather's bedside and felt his weakening breath. At that moment, something strange happened. My grandfather seemed to be able to see me. Although he could no longer speak, I could sense from his surprised expression that he was aware of my presence. Even though we could not communicate with words, at that moment, our souls seemed to mingle with each other and we felt each other's presence. It was a connection that transcended matter. I placed my hand gently on his, hoping to convey warmth and strength. Although he could not respond, I believed he could feel my presence. Suddenly, there was a piercing sound coming from the machine next to me. I knew that my grandfather had passed away. My heart was filled with grief. However, as I gazed at my grandfather's body, a small ball of light emerged from his forehead. It was rotating and emitting a faint, warm white light. This ball of light became larger and larger. As time passed, the ball of light took on the shape of my grandfather. I couldn't believe my eyes and I asked him, "Is that you?" "Grandfather." I heard a familiar voice, "Baby, it's so good to see you." I ran to him excitedly and hugged him tightly. For a moment, time seemed to stop and our connection with each other was re-established. My grandfather curiously asked me, "Why are you here?" I told him about my experience of being in a car accident. Just as we were communicating, a tunnel with a soft glow appeared in front of us. This tunnel exuded an air of mystery, as if it were a doorway to another world. We decided to explore the tunnel together. The tunnel emanated a bright light. As we walked into the tunnel, the scenery around us began to blur, as if we had crossed the boundary of time and space. The scenery in the tunnel was very beautiful and strange. We continued to walk along the tunnel, our hearts filled with anticipation. In the tunnel, my soul seemed to be purified. At the end of the tunnel, we saw a dazzling light. I turned my head to look at my grandfather, and his face was tinged with joy. We enjoyed this wonderful moment where our souls found a place to belong. After we passed through the dazzling light, it was as if we had entered a home where we truly belonged. Here, I felt a peace that I had never felt before. All the things that I felt were important on earth lost their meaning here. Our souls flew freely in this new world. Everything seemed so perfect, free from pain and worry. Suddenly, a man appeared before us, his presence filled with wisdom and compassion. He reached out and tenderly held his grandfather's hand. I could feel the love flowing between them. In that moment, this man began to help grandfather review his life. From his childhood to adulthood, from his family to his career. Every experience was presented in a clear way. I could feel my grandfather's emotions, from laughter and joy to frustration and sadness. As the memories progressed, I also understood the growth and lessons that my grandfather experienced throughout his life. His life was full of meaning and value, and his love brought endless warmth to those around him. In his company, my grandfather's soul was purified. When the guide finally told me that I could not yet join my grandfather in heaven, my heart was filled with loss. I begged the guide to stay in this beautiful world with my grandfather. Grandfather tenderly placed his hand on my shoulder. His gaze was filled with compassion. He told me, "Dear child, your mother still needs you, and there are many lost people who need your help and guidance. When you return to Earth, you can use your experience to help those in need and give them warmth and courage." His words touched my heart and I understood that I could not abandon my responsibilities on Earth. My grandfather and I hugged each other tightly and gave each other our last blessing. I saw my guide leading my grandfather to a large door. That door emanated a dazzling light, and it seemed to connect two worlds. After my grandfather entered the door, his clothes gradually turned into a white robe. This robe emitted a pure and brilliant light. His face also began to change, his wrinkles began to fade and his eyes became brighter. His image was much younger and full of vitality. Behind the door, my grandfather turned and waved goodbye to me. Even though we were about to part, I could feel his love and blessing. In that moment, I understood that this was not a permanent goodbye, but a temporary parting. I believed that at some point, our souls would be reunited again. I watched my grandfather until his figure completely disappeared behind that door. I felt an invisible force bringing me back to the real world. A shining light surrounded me and wrapped me in it. After a while, the hospital room and the people around me gradually became clear. I was lying in a hospital bed, and the smell of medicine permeated my surroundings. My mother was holding my hand tightly. Her eyes were filled with worry. When I returned home, my family did not mention my grandfather's death, but I knew their hearts were also filled with grief and longing. That night, I decided to tell them about my experience. We sat around the living room in a somewhat heavy atmosphere. I told them about the experience of my encounter with my grandfather. I described that beautiful world. I expressed it in words of comfort, letting them know that grandfather was doing well now. In that place, grandfather had gotten rid of his illness and troubles and was living a good life. At first, they didn't really believe what I said, but my words and expressions were full of sincerity and determination. In this moment, I felt the eyes of my family gradually become serene. They might not be able to meet their grandfather directly, but they were willing to believe that he was living a happy life in that world. We sat together in silence, our hearts filled with thoughts and blessings for our grandfather. From that night on, we gradually came to accept the passing of our grandfather. In the past few years, I have noticed a significant increase in social acceptance of this phenomenon. More and more people are willing to listen to my story, and they are showing more interest in my experience. However, there are still some people who are skeptical about the veracity of the story. I firmly believe that as long as I can impact society in a positive way and give hope to those who are lost, that's the best part of my story to share. I don't expect everyone to fully believe in my experience, because there are many strange phenomena in this world that cannot be explained by science. But it is this unexplained experience that has made me more deeply aware of the meaning of life and the mystery of existence. I hope that by sharing my experience, I can bring a ray of hope and inspiration to those who are lost and confused. If my story can make them rethink their lives and find a more meaningful path, then that is the greatest meaning of my sharing my story.